You got the numbers now. This is what I've been interested in.
I got some numbers for you, mate.
Let's do it.
Yeah, part 2 of our crank length test video here. We're eking this out to get as many videos out of it as we possibly can. So
I'm looking forward to part 8.
It was quite complex. There was a lot to do. So what I'm going to run you guys through here is how I tested the crank lengths and what my results were. Now, the idea here was to measure the 2 things that people really want to know about. Everyone asks me, if I shorten the cranks, am I going to lose power? Am I going to gain efficiency? And the idea was for me to test it just as an N of 1. This is only one person testing it, but to give myself a bit of an idea and so that I can tell my clients the expected outcomes of what's going to happen when they change their crank length. So the idea was we came up with a test protocol here. Now this was done here in my clinic with the temperature set at the same temperature every time, the same fan on me, everything was identical. The bike was identical, the kicker was identical, the setup was identical. The only thing I did was change the crank lengths. Now I had a week of adaptation of each crank length where in that week I tinkered with my position to get it as perfect as possible. I did some zone 2 riding, I did some bunch riding, I tried to keep my training all exactly the same. I made sure I didn't go to the gym in the 48 hours before the sprint testing and all that sort of stuff to try and keep it all the same. And I was pretty successful. I managed to basically go into each one of the tests feeling the same level of freshness. So I didn't have a day where I felt absolutely terrible. It was fairly successful. Now, you are going to get individual variation day to day, week to week on your fitness levels, but I think we came up with some results here which are really going to be quite interesting. They were quite interesting to me as well. So the test protocol that we went with, what I was trying to do here was assess the effect of shortening or lengthening the cranks on all-out sprint efforts. So this is basically a test of a flat-out 10-second sprint. Out of the saddle, I tried to start the first 2 at reasonably low cadences, and I started the second 2 at a higher cadence of 70, and I just wound the gear out into the highest RPM that I could get to. And these were 5 minutes of rest between each one, and after that we went into 2 30-second all-out efforts. Now these are very unpleasant, so I'm glad I didn't have to do too many of them. 15 seconds standing, 15 seconds seated, flat out as hard as possible. We then had a 10-minute rest between each one and then a final 10-minute rest at the end, followed by a 30-minute zone 2 cardiac drift test. And this is where I set the kicker up to just sit on my low-end zone 2, which is about 200 watts, and I had a heart rate monitor on. And the idea here was to basically assess if there's greater efficiency with shorter cranks, maybe you'll see a lower heart rate. Ideally, you would test this with something like a volume oximeter sort of test where you basically, you're measuring your oxygen consumption efficiency, that sort of thing. We don't have access to that much gear.
Low budget channel, mate.
Low budget channel. If anyone wants to donate any of that stuff, please. It would have been good to even do a skin prick test, lactate test. Yeah. That would have been great. This was a bit of a bogus one. I'll run you through that in a minute. Well, I got absolutely nothing out of that. But the first 3/4 of the test, very, very interesting. So your obvious limitations, the best way to measure all of the efficiency is with oxygen consumption or lactate testing, right? This is a bit outside of our scope. The second major limitation is the difficulty in measuring the thing that really matters, I think, more than all of this stuff, which is the aerodynamic loss or gain from changing the crank length. When you go shorter, a lot of the time you can bend forwards, tuck down much better. There's a much better aerodynamic profile that you're presenting to the wind, and so you are much more efficient at higher speeds. It's very, very hard to measure that without a wind tunnel, and so that bit of information was something we couldn't test as well. The second major limitation is how much power offset do you get either way. The theory being that with the shorter cranks, you might be a little bit better on those longer efforts, but a little bit worse on the shorter efforts, which is what we're going to come to next. And how much is that going to affect race outcomes or bunch ride outcomes? Now up on your screen, you'll see a much nicer graphic of these results. I've put these in some bar graphs and stuff for you guys to visualize what's actually happened. But this is the raw data, and I've averaged the 4 sprint efforts and I've averaged then the 2 30-second all-out efforts to get all these numbers. Now the first thing you'll notice is that my numbers are woeful. And that's
actually not too bad.
I like the word woeful. I'm going to use woeful. I'm going to stick with it. This is pretty bad. Now I'm about 66 kilos at the moment, and this is about as good as I've ever been. So I am all slow twitch. Back in the day, I had a coach who used to refer to me as the most extremely proportioned athlete he'd ever seen in terms of my power generation. So I could produce, north of 300 watts for half an hour. but I couldn't produce much more than 800 watts in a sprint, which is, it's pretty extreme. So I'm all slow twitch. I'm never going to be beating anyone in a sprint. I struggle to crack 4 digits. And only once on one of these efforts did I actually crack 1,000 watts, which was with the longest cranks. So yeah, pretty terrible results, but let's go through them because there's some interesting noise here in the data. So you'll notice the first thing that you'll see is a pretty linear progression here of the 10-second peak power as the crank length got longer. Now this is not a great surprise to most people out there. You think, well, longer cranks, you can generate more instantaneous force. And that was exactly what we saw. Now, for about 10 or 15 years, I've been telling people that you're probably not going to lose much off your peak power performance as you go to shorter cranks. Turns out this is actually a reasonable change. There's there is 70 watts or 69 watts in the average here from the peak, from the 155s to the 172.5s, and that's quite a lot. That's close to 10%. It's about 8% or so, and that is quite a big loss. So there was a fair bit of instantaneous torque generation problem, shall we say, with the very short cranks. Makes sense because the shorter cranks require a fair bit more force to generate the same power at the actual chain. The 10-second average, a slight jump down here, which could be just I was a bit fresher on this day, or I peaked on one too early, or whatever. But generally, you will see a linear progression upwards as well. And the discrepancy here between, say, 900 watts and 834 for the longest versus shortest cranks, is actually a pretty big number. Now, I didn't think this would be anywhere near as big as it was, but it was quite a large discrepancy between the two. Similar effect, but less clear cut on the 30-second efforts. You'll see there's a little bit of a jump down here to the 160s. Again, there's a bit of measurement error here. You're going to have some of the efforts fresher than others. I only did 2, so we're only averaging 2 numbers here. And again, you can see the numbers generally get larger with the longer cranks. And the 30-second average, fairly linear progression, also getting higher. Now this is about 30 watts, which on a 30-second effort, if you were an elite athlete and you've got more grunt than me, like some of the world's best riders here would be producing sort of north of 1,000 watts for 30 seconds. If you were to lose that much going to a much shorter crank, that'd be a pretty big deal if the numbers were larger. So really, really interesting to see a fairly linear progression with the peak power and the 30-second and the averages all being slightly better, generally speaking, with the longer cranks. So that's part 1 of our results. Very, very curious. I was not expecting that much of a result, but here we are. The results don't lie. The numbers don't lie. Part 2 of the results were the zone 2 power output. Now, the idea here was to basically sit the kicker on a zone 2 load, measure my heart rate, see if there was less cardiac drift with shorter cranks to try and measure some sort of efficiency gain. Now, this was a complete waste of time because I found out...
We've just lost half the audience, Neil.
I found out very quickly that as soon as I sit on a trainer with a fan on me in zone 2, within about 3 minutes, my heart rate jumps to this number, which is quite high, and it just sits there for the whole time. And it makes no difference whether I'm on whichever crank I was on. It was exactly the same heart rate number. And I spoke to a few people in the know about this, and their suggestion, because my zone 2 heart rate on the road at the same wattage is about 128 to 135 on the road.
Whoa, that's huge.
Enormous difference.
Wow.
This is a heat stress limiter. So what's happening here is I am very, very reliant upon the airflow over my body to cool me down. And as soon as you remove enough of that, my body has trouble thermoregulating. So the limiter here was basically core temperature, body temperature rise, and this was absolutely useless because all of the cranks I measured exactly the same thing. Now on the road, I actually could not determine any difference doing some zone 2 rides in heart rate with all of the cranks. So that was really interesting. I didn't appear to have any difference in efficiency that I could measure with heart rate alone. Now, obviously the best way to measure that, oxygen consumption or lactate testing, which we didn't have access to here, but not an enormous difference. What there was a difference in was zone 2 speed on the road. With the shorter cranks sitting at 200 watts, I was about 1 kilometre to 1 kilometre an hour to 1.5 kilometres an hour faster than I was with the 172s for the same wattage because of the enormously low position that I could hold. I could tuck right down, I could reach right out, fold myself into a much lower position, and the 155s way more aerodynamically usable. So this is the interesting trade-off, and that's the topic of the last bit of our discussion here, is the trade-off between the different crank lengths. So let's have a bit of a general discussion about how these different cranks felt to ride. The short cranks require very, very high cadences to sustain high power outputs. So I found myself with the 155s having to operate well north of 100 RPM, or I just had absolutely no grunt on the bike. And that makes sense because they're way too short for me. I had to keep them spinning super fast just to maintain any sort of decent power. They were a bit of a problem on some surgy bunch rides. I just kept getting tailed out of the draft all the time as the bunch would surge because I just couldn't hit the pedal and accelerate as rapidly as I could with the longer cranks. The trade-off was when I was riding with friends in the front of a group or something, just tapping along in zone 2 or 3, they were fantastic as if the road was flat. I could just sit down in that low aero tuck, the hips felt amazing, really, really open, and I could just sit at 100 or 110 on the cadence and just zing it out. It was brilliant. They were really, really good at maintaining a steady state tempo. There was a concomitant kind of flip side of the other coin, if you like, at the 172 mark. I had that really big neuromuscular ability. Seated, it was much better. I could stay in the draft much better. But when I was in the wind, I couldn't tuck down anywhere near as well as I could, and it was nowhere near as efficient for the same sort of wattage. I also felt a fair bit more unstable with the 172s, a lot more pelvic rock, and that makes sense because the longer crank arm is much harder to control due to the larger arc of motion that your leg is operating in. So there was a fair bit of a difference there. I could produce about 100 watts less seated with the really short cranks than I could with the really long cranks with the 172s. So that was a really bad trade-off in some cases with those short, sharp burst efforts required for bunch riding. So something to consider if you're thinking about going really short. If I found myself climbing on a gradient steeper than about 7% and I was in the second bottom gear or the bottom gear on the bike, if I let my cadence drop below about 95 or 90 with the 155mm cranks, it was a real problem. I couldn't get back up on top of the pedals properly. The 160s, not as bad. The 165s, no problem at all. And the 172.5s, I felt like I had a lot of ability to surge, but not as much ability to hold that high power output for as long. So a really interesting trade-off. The extremely open hip angles of the really short cranks did allow me to drop into an extremely low aero tuck, and the efficiency much better. At really high speeds, you could just feel you were able to hold that high speed for much longer because I was able to fold myself down so deeply. So really, really interesting. So what we've got here is a series of considerations, things you need to consider when you're thinking about shortening or lengthening your cranks. And I've written it out for you here in this really dodgy little Venn diagram that I've sketched up here on the whiteboard. Your considerations with your crank length change. Aerodynamics. The short cranks, they're going to be better almost always. You're going to be able to tolerate more drop to the bars. You'll be able to fold yourself down lower. The worse your hip mobility is, the more you'll get out of them. The burst power. We've pretty much, I've at least fairly conclusively proven to myself that in my case, my burst power production, my neuromuscular power production is way better with longer cranks and much worse with short cranks. Something to consider. Your ability to tolerate really high cadences. Now, some big riders that I've got just can't spin their legs much over 100 RPM. So if they go down to a crank length that requires that, they're going to have some trouble. They just won't be able to move such a massive muscle back and forth at such a high RPM. So if you've got fairly poor capacity for high cadences and you just can't really easily ride it over 100 because you're a big guy or a big lady, you're not going to get as much out of shorter cranks. The target event that you're going for. If you're doing a time trial, a steady state time trial, something like an Ironman or a half Ironman or a 40K flat TT, for example, a longish, flattish time trial, the shorter cranks, there's not many downsides there because you can basically wind your wattage up to your target and just stay on it and stay really aerodynamic. So I'm not seeing many disadvantages to very short cranks for time trialing unless the course is very lumpy. And the last one, perhaps the biggest one from my perspective, biomechanics. If you've got really bad hip mobility, really short legs, this type of thing, if you've got really poor mobility, super low seat height, all that sort of stuff, you're going to do much better with shorter cranks. These overlapping considerations, if you like, this is who you need to think about all of this stuff if you're considering shortening your cranks at home. How short should you go will depend on each individual and how large each one of these considerations is for you. So for example, if you've got terrible hip mobility and really short legs, the biomechanics consideration is going to be really, really outsized. It's going to be by far and away the biggest thing that you're going to want to consider. If you're fairly normal, no major problems physiologically, sort of a regular type of seat height, nothing unusual about you, but you're targeting a half Ironman or something like that, on a flat course like Bustleton or something like that, you might want to consider that consideration circle is going to be much larger for you. That's going to be one of your biggest considerations, is your target event. And vice versa, if you're doing a lot of sprinting in criterium races and that sort of thing, this is going to be a really big thing for you. So these are the things that you at home, I would urge you to consider if you're considering shortening or lengthening your cranks for any reason. Just have a think about what's going to create the biggest and the smallest effects in your individual case, because it's going to be different for everyone. And unfortunately, the one thing I have figured out here is that there is no one size fits all for crank length. Everyone's going to have a different experience depending upon their body and their event and their ability. We do have one more data point coming, and the man behind the camera, usually Craig Wiggins, who is a completely polar opposite style of rider to me, much more muscular. He's got literally twice as much sprint power as I've got. I've roped him into doing a very similar set of testing protocols. So he is very, very much a sprinter type body type, and I'm the polar opposite. He's going to do a really similar protocol with the different crank lengths. And this is going to be really interesting to see with the two different body types, what sort of results we get, where he's better, where he's worse, how much of an effect there is. Maybe we'll see completely different results. Maybe they will be very, very similar. But Craig's going to come in with his results in probably a month or two once he's gone through all the different crank lengths. So stay tuned for that. We'll tack that one onto the end of this. Thanks, guys.